Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Mistress of Auschwitz by Terrance D. Williamson. Narrated by Kirsten Potter. I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty that remains. Anne Frank. Chapter 1. La Venezia. The cardinal error of the Germans who opposed Nazism was their failure to unite against it. William L. Shirer. Berlin. Staring blankly at the stucco ceiling above her bed, Eleanore lay with her hands folded neatly across her stomach. Despite the hours spent in solitude and the darkness of the night, sleep had evaded her. Again. Not that her bed was all that disagreeable, nor was her little apartment devoid of comfort, but her worries kept her mind affixed to consciousness. As was becoming her nocturnal custom, Eleanore had scarcely attempted to lure sleep. Instead, she remained clothed in the same plain navy-blue dress that she wore the day before, and lay on top of her sheets, ready for the day's demands. She listened to her breathing in and out, and felt the rising and falling of her belly against her hands. She timed her breathing with the patient ticking of her little silver watch spread out on the table stand next to the bed, reminding her of the inevitable. She would endure another day absent of the rest granted to countless others. She glanced over at the persistent watch, sitting oblivious to the anguish it was causing her, and sighed when she discerned the time in the dim light of dawn. 6:30. Realizing her efforts to enter slumber were futile, she sat up slowly as the blood rushed to her head and her eyes tracked stars bouncing about the room. She ran her hand across the bedsheet, feeling the smoothness of the linen. She looked longingly at the patterns of stitched roses, like a lover mourning the absence of their partner. The bed had not offered the sweet solace she coveted, but instead operated as an instrument of taunting enticement, lacking fulfillment, yet still desired. A true romance. Not that she could blame the inanimate for withholding rest, as her recent trepidation seemed fit enough for the challenge. Despite her concerns, she forced herself to her feet, slid into her awaiting slippers, and walked to the stove, which was a mere 10 feet from the bed. How she loved her humble apartment. It was a meager one-room flat that met her needs adequately, with the bathroom, kitchen, and bed all within 2 strides of each other. For an unwed, childless woman approaching 40, it suited her perfectly. Yet the minimalism seemed to scream what her late parents somehow still found a way to communicate. She was alone. Her defense, which she had perfected with each fresh argument, lay within her career. She was married to her seamstress shop. She smiled as she recalled her father's chuckle at the justification and her mother's scowl of disapproval. As any child of a stubborn Austrian mother can attest, Eleanore found herself in a losing battle of wills. Yet, when arranging courtship failed by Eleanor's boredom of the suitors paraded, her mother resorted to demanding grandchildren. It was no longer a request. It was only with the passing of her parents did she regret failing them in that regard. Otherwise, a life spent rearing children with an inattentive husband was left undesired. Providence, in its wisdom, had risen her to a station above that of an ordinary housewife. Not that she detested the thought of having children, but her attention was stolen by her entrepreneurial pursuits, and there was little, if anything, that could break the spell. A husband, too, would certainly suffer the sting of her prioritization, and she could not, in good conscience, bestow that on anyone. The kettle screeched, and, returning her mind to the present, Eleanore poured herself a cup of tea. With the warmth spreading through her fingers, she took her drink to the main attraction of her living quarters, the balcony. Opening the double French doors, she walked out to the crisp winter air and leaned over the steel railing. Raising the cup to her nose, she let the fragrance fill her lungs as she observed the city crawling to a start. While she loved this little routine, Eleanore found her enjoyment fading with the troubling thought that such peaceful mornings were numbered. To an extent, she was thankful she was not isolated in these uncertainties as she watched the passers-by in the street below. The usual smiles and waves of greeting were growing absent as each looked at the pavement before their feet, only offering a tip of the hat to their closest confidants as they hurried along. Weariness from war attrition was burning its mark on society. While many were beginning to understand Hitler's intentions as malicious, those in positions of privilege didn't perceive his objectives as vindictive in nature. Still, the Socialist Democrat Party, of which Eleanor was a respected patron, sought to harness the Führer's ambitions. But who could challenge the almighty savior of Germany? To defy him was to betray the fatherland, and most who adhered to an incorrect political party paid a hefty price. Some were shot as traitors of the state, others were taken for forced labor. Rumors circulated as to the terrors within the concentration camps, but Eleanor found the description so horrific that she assumed they were exaggerated pieces of Allied propaganda. Despite the potential consequences, and thanks to Eleanor's ingenuity, the party had thrived as an underground resistance group. Her shop, La Venezia, named after her love of Italian design, was situated in the very heart of Berlin. It provided the ideal location for secret meetings with inconsequential members who had avoided state detection, such as herself. But the numbers had been reduced of late. One by one, those who had attended regularly were beginning to disappear. More disturbing was that no one could account for where they had vanished. Eleanor found herself questioning reality when all traces of an acquaintance were erased. Some she assumed to have been murdered, while others were taken prisoner. Still, the location of their meetings had gone undiscovered. Whether this was by chance or by design, Eleanor didn't know, but she resolved to continue despite the dwindling turnout. Now, however, a new development had been implemented, which would likely make her shop a target for Nazi inspection, and was the cause for her sleepless nights. The Nuremberg race laws had issued another decree to the swelling list of edicts. Jews were to be eliminated from commerce and employment. While they had already been removed from public office, ordered to abstain from schools, and levied with insufferable taxes, they could no longer be employed. While most employers had dismissed their Jewish staff, Eleanor had maintained 2 in her employment at the shop. In fact, they were her only employees. Further obstructing the issue, they were an elderly couple with no children to depend on for finances, and she could not simply dismiss them. The husband, Alexander, manned the counter and greeted each guest warmly, while his wife, Ruth, worked with Eleanor mending the dresses or designing new ones for their wealthy clientele. Due to respect for Alexander, who preferred to be called Alex, many of the customers did not report his race to the authorities, but instead refrained from using their services any longer. With the decline in business came an increasing financial strain that was difficult for Eleanor to bear. Maintaining their salary was possible, though scarcely, yet she was determined to not abandon them in their hour of need. The bond of companionship, too, added to her dilemma, as Ruth and Alex had taken upon the role of her late parents, while she, in return, had filled the void of their barrenness. She helped them with daily chores, while they provided her with warm meals, and Alex repaired more than a handful of busted pipes in the apartment, free of charge, of course. Expedience, she understood, drew upon the logic of survival, but she was burdened with a conscience which she refused to sacrifice upon the altar of convenience. And, while she was not a Jew herself, she felt disgusted by their treatment. After all, Alex and Ruth were more Germanic than she was, born and raised in Berlin as 7th, possibly 8th generation Jews. They were even apostates from Judaism, and their parents had converted to the Protestant faith. It was at church that Ruth and Alex met, were wed, and spent their Sundays in dedicated worship. But what did piety count for in Nazi Germany if it wasn't devoted to racial purity? The Nazis relinquished no clemency upon religious groups, even those who adhered to Christianity. Race was their only concern. With a final sip, Eleanor took a deep breath before leaving the balcony and returned to her apartment. Gathering her purse, black felt hat, and slipping into her heels, Eleanore opened her apartment door, but couldn't bring herself to step out. Lingering, she glanced back into the apartment, unwilling to trade the tranquility for the precariousness of what likely lay ahead. She wondered if it was foolish to continue in her path, with the understanding that the consequences may be grave. Or was it bravery, then, to endure in her striving to bring Germany out of Hitler's shadow? She was certain that a socialist democratic government was the dream of many, even though they dared not express it. So, for their sake, for the silent majority, for those too afraid to speak, she would suffer the penalties of her resistance. Closing the door behind her, Eleanore locked up and half-jogged down 2 flights of stairs until she came to the foyer. Entering the street, Eleanore walked briskly along her way toward La Venezia. Keeping her gaze low, as was now the custom, Eleanore passed by a square with a pile of black ash and charred logs in the center. Another book burning, she thought, as she held her hand over her nose to block out the remaining stench of burnt leather and wood. She strained to resist the temptation of inspection to determine if any literature had survived the flames. What a terrible shame. She watched as others mirrored her repulsion of the smell, yet, like she, no one dared venture closer than necessary for fear of reprisal. Keeping her eyes locked on the pavement in front of her, Eleanore passed by the all too familiar streets. The bakery on the corner, with the once cheerful baker, whose disposition had soured after his sons had been conscripted, the coffee shop opposite the bakery, where Eleanore had occasionally purchased tea when her supplies ran short. Except now the business was closing, as no one would gather, for concern of the Nazis suspecting them of treasonous plotting. "Where 2 or more were gathered, there Hitler is," had swiftly become a favorite saying amongst those brave enough to voice their dissent. Eventually, Eleanore rounded the corner to her quaint shop. While situated in the center of Berlin, La Venezia had been tucked away down a side street that seemed to her a haven from the hustle and bustle of daily life. Only a handful of other shops populated the narrow street, and the foot traffic was nothing compared to some of the main strips. While unfavorable for business operations, the seclusion was to Eleanor's preference, as she could hardly tolerate the crowds. The cramming of busy people going about their own pursuits in quite possibly the rudest fashion, bumping, pushing, and squeezing past to get ahead of the next person. On the occasions she was required to venture down such detestable passageways, she made certain to attempt the mission when the least amount of people were expected. Rummaging through her purse for her keys, Eleanore cursed the poor lighting of the street, the one blemish in an otherwise ideal environment. Not only was the street narrow, but it also faced north, meaning the sun blessed them with its warmth for a mere couple hours per day. This, of course, was not of much concern to Eleanore, as she was usually buried in her windowless room at the back of the shop. Still, some natural light would help the place seem a tad more welcoming, which, on the surface, was rather bland. The forest-green windowsills and frames were ill-matched against the gray bricks, and each summer Eleanore swore she would paint it a bright red. But each summer came and went, along with all the hectic demands of being an entrepreneur, and the right time never arrived. Aha! Eleanore pulled out her keys in victory and placed them to the door, only to realize that the handle had been broken. Stepping back, Eleanore gasped as she read the black graffiti plastered above the shattered glass window, "Jews are not welcome." Glancing inside, she noticed the floor was covered with broken glass and littered with Nazi propaganda pamphlets. Her little shop, her source of pride, had been offered over to the madness of anti-Semitism. Paralyzed, Eleanore stood before the one thing that had provided her with direction and given her hope for a brighter future. Her dwindling clientele would surely cease altogether should news of this escape, which it certainly would. Berlin was a large city, but gossip traveled fast, not to mention that this had been the last haven for the political meetings, and without the venue the party would disintegrate. "Oh!" a voice called from behind her, and Eleanore turned to see Ruth clasping a hand over her mouth in shock. Her large purple purse had fallen, and lipstick and a compact lay scattered on the pavement. With his hands on his wife's shoulders, Alex's eyes welled as he was lost for words to convey his shock. The three stood in stunned silence, with the only sound coming from the wind rushing through the narrow street and a crumpled newspaper rolling by. Eleanor felt her cheeks turning crimson from embarrassment, but also felt a rage unlike any she had experienced before. This was her shop, her pride and joy, and it had been ruined because of some ill-begotten and senseless Nazis. She squeezed her hands into fists as she plotted a fictional revenge. Such ignorance! Eleanor shook her head as she fumed. Still, Ruth and Alex stared at the graffiti, frozen in terror by the warning. Anyone would be frightened, but they were an elderly couple, and escaping the country was not an option afforded by their age. They were an odd couple to have been paired together, and not just because of their mismatched physiques. Ruth was a rather plump, yet tall woman who carried her weight in the upper half of her body, while her scrawny legs seemed to have been snatched from someone else. Adding to her imbalance, she conveyed a vibrant and sometimes overpowering demeanor with a boisterous voice to match. Alex, on the other hand, was a slouched, slender man, nearly a half a foot shorter than his wife. He wore the same outfit each day, which Eleanor was amused to learn he had multiples of the same clothes. A white button-up shirt underneath a gray suit jacket with gray pants held in place by suspenders that were so loose that they had lost much of their purpose. Yet, for the mismatch in appearance, they were complementary in spirit. Though tall in stature, Ruth was short in temper, while Alex was patient, kind, but a little too subservient. Somehow this combination worked, and when they smiled together, they brought a light into Eleanor's world. On the other hand, their feuds were entertaining, and the outcome predictable. Ruth was the undefeated champion. "I thought I had given you the weekend off." Eleanor spoke quietly as she looked at them awkwardly, unsure of how to react. She was a sensitive woman, but she often failed to articulate her feelings adequately. Besides, her embarrassment was radiant, and she couldn't find the sentiment that she wished to convey. "We couldn't leave you to do the order by yourself." Alex bent down slowly to collect his wife's items and place them back into her purse. Straightening with a groan, he held out the purse for his wife, but Ruth was unable to break her gaze from the vandalism. Shrugging, Alex threw it over his shoulder. "Well, I suppose none of us can finish the job now." Ruth stood back and inspected the damage. "A broken window won't stop me." Ruth seized the purse from Alex as if he had stolen it and marched forward. Realizing the door handle had been busted, Ruth improvised and, taking a rock left from the vandals, smashed through the door window and unlocked it from the inside. "What on earth are you doing?" Alex frowned. "Oh, don't look at me like that," Ruth growled at her husband. "Sweep this glass up so we can return the store to its proper form." "Yes, dear." Alex's shoulders fell as he walked obediently into the shop. At the best of times, Ruth was not of the disposition to handle defiance, and Alex knew his place well enough. Eleanor remained reserved as she watched them deal with this outrage in their own chaotic manner. However uncomfortable she had been to have them witness this hatred, Eleanor was pleased to have their guided company. "Should I call the officials?" Alex kicked the shards around with his feet, unsure of where to begin. "Are you mad?" Ruth threw her hands onto her hips as her cheeks burned red. "For all they know, we aren't Jews, and how long do you think that will last with them poking their heads around here?" "Well, someone found out." Alex pointed to the graffiti. "And you best get that cleaned up before the Führer himself wonders what Jews are doing in Berlin." Ruth huffed as she stormed into the back room to begin her work. "Thank you." Eleanor touched Alex on his shoulder, who shook his head, relinquishing the credit. He had no choice in his designation. Joining Ruth in the back room, Eleanor sat on the bench opposite the old Jewess and began stitching away. The two worked in silence with the machines, sewing in their blissful ignorance. The dress in question was for the wife of a Nazi officer, and she demanded perfection. Eleanor was determined to deliver on that promise, and was thankful Ruth's skillful hands would be helping, though she wondered how the official's wife would react should she discover that a Jew created the dress. The truth was, though Eleanor didn't admit it, half her success was due to Ruth. Yet Ruth refused pay raises despite Eleanor's relentless attempts. Still, Eleanor would slip in an extra bill or two into Ruth's purse when she wasn't looking, or pay for meals when they ventured out on the town. "How's your portion coming along?" Eleanor paused to look over at Ruth, but she didn't reply. With tears streaming, Ruth covered her face to hide her shame. She was a durable woman, and this display of vulnerability was not afforded with much ease. "Ruth?" Eleanor asked sympathetically, yet quietly to provide some semblance of dignity. "Sorry." Ruth shook her head as she blew her nose into a handkerchief. "I tend to cry when I'm angry." "Nothing to forgive." Eleanor gave a limp smile to try and relieve the tension. "This is the end for us, isn't it?" Ruth collected herself and wiped the tears from her eyes. "They can't stop me from employing you." Eleanor tried to cheer Ruth up, but failed to even convince herself. "They can," Ruth sniffled, "and they will." "I'll pay you in private, off the books," Eleanor smiled. "We can't ask you to do such a thing." Ruth waved her handkerchief in dismissal and returned to her work. Walking over to her employee's bench, Eleanor placed her hand on Ruth's. "I'm unable to continue without you. I need you. We're in this together, to the bitter end." "But they'll send us to the camps," Ruth choked. "All our friends and relations, they have been taken and never heard from again. I should think starving in our own home would be preferable to forced labor. I'll be of no service at such unforgiving work." "It won't come to that," Eleanor sighed. She knew the realities, and how unlikely it was that she would escape the consequences. "Excuse me." Alex knocked before poking his head through the door. "An officer would like to speak with you." "I told you not to call the authorities!" Ruth's eyes bulged with incredulity. "I didn't!" Alex half shouted back in defense. "Then who did?" Ruth asked sarcastically. "None around these parts care much for our misfortunes." "I don't believe it's about the windows." Alex glanced at Eleanor. "It's all right." Eleanor nodded at Alex. "I'll be right there." "Do you suppose it's about party business?" Ruth spoke quietly as she fiddled with her machine, trying to distract her nerves. "Possibly." Eleanor frowned, wondering how Ruth knew. "I found a pamphlet left on the floor a while back." Ruth offered a quick smile. "Don't worry, I discarded it." "I appreciate your discretion." Eleanor smiled back, but internally she was petrified her secret had not been as hidden as she supposed. "Miss Hodys, open up immediately!" An aggressive knock rattled against the door. With a deep breath, Eleanor walked over to the door and, opening it quickly, stood tall before an officer who, she was surprised to discover, was a childhood acquaintance. "Horst?" Eleanor couldn't believe her fortune. "Is that really you?" "This isn't the time for pleasantries." Horst held his hands firmly behind his back and stuck his chin in the air, though he failed to hide the subtle gratification at seeing her. Eleanor was beautiful, after all, with striking blue eyes, high cheekbones, and curly brown hair, the Aryan dream. If not for her height, or lack thereof, and her advanced age, she would have been selected by the propaganda machine as a display of perfection. During their younger years, Horst had endeavored to secure her affection on a few occasions, but with no success. For his part, Horst was a smaller man, often bullied during adolescence for his stature. This mistreatment burdened Horst to the extent where he eventually attempted suicide, but the rope failed and he escaped with a broken leg. At least, that's how Eleanor remembered the rumors that were circulated to account for his absence from studies. "Then say what you've come to say, though I am delighted to see a familiar face." Eleanor motioned for him to enter. "Thank you." Horst withdrew from his previous aggression, but remained guarded. Stepping into the shop room, he removed his hat and was about to continue, but then spotted Ruth sitting at the bench. "I trust her with my life." Eleanor noticed the officer's hesitation. "You shouldn't." Horst studied Ruth as if looking for something hidden. When it was apparent the officer would not continue, Eleanor turned her gaze to her assistant and politely indicated for some privacy. Though indignant at the removal, Ruth submitted and left the room, but not before offering Horst an unapologetic glare. "Now that you've kept me in suspense," Eleanor spoke quietly, "what is so urgent?" "You've been placed on a list," Horst whispered. "A list?" Eleanor swallowed as her eyes grew large. "What kind of list?" "The kind that are handed down to me." Horst looked away, ashamed of his duty. While some would look upon his station as an honorable service to the state, rounding up the undesirables required a callous disposition. "I see." Eleanor's heart pounded violently within her chest. "But I don't understand what I've done that deserves such a designation." Scoffing, Horst raised his eyebrows. "You know perfectly well." "I'm afraid I don't." Eleanor shrugged and persisted in feigning innocence. "I came here at the risk of my life." Horst returned to whispering. "You must leave Berlin, now." "And where should I go?" Eleanor looked around at her shop full of fabrics, threads, and half-finished dresses hanging on mannequins. The idea of leaving behind her life's work when she had sacrificed marriage and children to obtain her dreams was near impossible. "England? The Americas?" Horst scratched the back of his neck. "Anywhere that isn't in Nazi hands." "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor squinted. "I haven't spoken to you in years. You owe me no favors." Horst thought for a moment, trying to articulate what he desired to say, and fumbled with the hat in his hand. "There are only a few people that I can recall who were kind to me. You didn't join in with the heckling or the practical jokes, and you certainly didn't make me wish that I were dead." "They were rather mean-spirited." Eleanor bit her cheek. "But I don't remember us being all that close." "Oh, we weren't." Horst glanced away. He had a rather nervous nature, which opened the door for ridicule from those of an unkind disposition. "But you were never cruel. You refused to engage with their behavior and came to my defense on occasion. I owe you a kindness in return." "Horst," Eleanor shook her head, "I appreciate your forewarning, but I've done nothing to place myself on a list. This must be some sort of mistake." "You're a member of the Socialist Democratic Party that is seeking to undermine the Führer and sacred Germany." Horst gritted his teeth. "Adding to your sins, you've not only harbored Jews, but you've employed them in direct violation of the racial laws." "I'm not leaving." Eleanor stood tall in defiance. "You have 24 hours until I return." Horst put his cap firmly back on his head. "I've offered you the charity of a warning. It's up to you how to respond to this information. I wish you the best. I really do." With that, Horst stormed out of the room and left a shocked Eleanor to mull on the consequences of her actions. Leaning against the wall, Eleanor placed her hand to her chest as her breathing labored. "What did he want?" Ruth burst back into the room, with Alex following closely behind, their concern painted across their faces. "He's not after you." Eleanor squeezed her own shoulder, which was stiffening from the tension. "Then what?" Ruth persisted and studied Eleanor. "He informed me that—" Eleanor paused. Somehow speaking the truth would shatter whatever disbelief she clung to. "He informed me that my name is on a list." "Oh, my child." Ruth embraced Eleanor, who didn't know quite how to respond to the affection. "I'm not sure what the best course of action would be." Eleanor patted Ruth on her back, who broke off the embrace. "We must leave." Ruth shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "Tonight." "Think, Ruth." Eleanor gazed upon her with hopelessness. "If my name is on a list, I will be stopped at the border." "Then get a different name." Alex winked. "What do you mean?" Eleanor frowned. "We have a friend." Ruth placed her hands on Eleanor's arms and rubbed up and down like a mother warming her child from the cold. "A man that we trust, who has helped many Jews escape." Is this true?" Eleanor looked to Alex, who nodded as he held his hands behind his back. "Then why haven't you taken this avenue?" "We're too old to travel." Alex shrugged. "But—"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?